where we are in the war in a while, but it's it's a real honor and privilege for us to host you, knowing that just about a year ago you were the U.S. commander of all U.S. forces in Europe and also the overall NATO commander for all NATO forces when the full-scale invasion started last February 24th. Obviously, the war started in 2014. The U.S. intelligence and military and our national security spokespeople had been telling the public, and obviously behind the scenes telling NATO allies, this is not a drill, this is not Russia trying to threaten people or kind of intimidate people into concessions. This is a very high and real probability of a full-scale invasion. But at the end of the day, even though you probably knew there was a very good chance that it was coming, could you maybe just let us know what it's like to be the commander of NATO, to be with your fellow commanders, European commanders, that morning when Russia launched this massive assault on Ukraine?
Well, first of all, it's like most endeavors, you feel and synthesize with all of your compatriots when you embrace a conflict of this magnitude. So number one, we had a good sense this was coming. And for most of you that paid very close attention to what was taking place in the region, in the summer of 2021, there was also a similar buildup with Russian forces in the vicinity of the border of Ukraine, and there was a high likelihood that actually was going to be an invasion as well. So to say that we weren't prepared would be an incorrect statement. We were certainly prepared, and we were certainly privileged to have had the opportunity to represent the European nations and the United States in doing the right thing every step of the way. And for all of us, we all grew up, and for so many of you that are part and parcel of this council, you're here because you care. You got to where you got, and so many of you have served in distinguished capacities because you're very curious about this journey called life, and you're very, very committed to doing the right thing. And when you're in a situation like we were in February of 22, you're surrounded by those same kinds of people. So there's never this feeling of being overwhelmed. There's this feeling that you've got to do the right thing. So the sense of urgency is sky high. And when you have individual sense of urgency and you're with a group of patriots that are attempting to do the same thing from so many other nations, it's something that you're very, very committed to. And food doesn't matter, sleep doesn't matter, nothing matters except doing the right thing at times like that. And that's kind of the sense of the SHAPE headquarters and the sense of EUCOM headquarters in February of 2022. And I would also say that there was nobody in our headquarters that was not prepared for what they were about to embrace at the time.
And just thank you again for all of you who served, and for those who are still serving now. Your compatriots are picked up where you stepped back. There could be Monday morning quarterbacks, starting from the Bush administration's approach to Putin to what Obama did after Putin took Crimea and started kind of a insurgency and a civil war in the Donbass, through Trump, through Biden. But maybe overall, how would you address the criticism that while Biden in many ways has been very supportive of Ukraine, especially in terms of getting fellow NATO countries behind them, it's been this incrementalism in terms of more lethal, more effective, more advanced weaponry. First, it's how many javelins will we give them. Then it's what howitzers, what artillery pieces will we give them. Then it's HIMARS. Then we'll give them Abrams tanks, but it's taken a long time. And now we're discussing F-16s. The balance of that is escalation and not wanting to potentially tip Putin over an edge when he's already tacitly and even directly threatened the use of potentially tactical nuclear weapons. How do you assess the Biden's approach since the war started?
Well, let me start with President Biden himself, and I'll speak to you as a former military commander who, at this very moment, I abide by the basic philosophy that I grew up with. I am politically neutral. I don't seek the press. I certainly don't seek the press today because, as we all know, if you represent a news agency, odds are somebody will accuse you of picking a political side. I prefer to stay as far from that as I possibly can. I will say that the sense of urgency that I've witnessed from President Biden from the first time we talked until when I departed the service was the same tremendous sense of urgency that I sensed when I had the opportunity to work closely with President Obama, and the same sense of urgency and the same seriousness that I sensed when I had the opportunity to work very close to President Trump. And I'm not trying to say this to be Pollyanna-ish. What I like about the United States of America is when the president of our country is pushed into serious territory and having to make tough decisions, there is no sense of backing off and willingness to roll their sleeves up and get serious about the task at hand. And in those situations, it was nice to see that the military policy that I've witnessed during my time serving in the United States military, the difference in the military policy between President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden, quite honestly, very, very little. Their number one concern was to make sure that the American treasure, those soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Guardians, Coast Guardmen, and DOD civilians, what the presidents, those three that I mentioned, what they cared about most in every one of their decisions was the livelihood of our sons and daughters. And it starts right there. And the subsequent decisions that are made after that are made with that in mind. And for most of us, you would agree, that's a good foundation to have. And I've had the deep luxury to have the opportunity to work side by side with numerous presidents and prime ministers of the 31 nations of NATO, and I see the same, the dedication, the seriousness. Now, getting to the specifics of this conflict, Ronan, that you asked, the strategic objectives that we, NATO, and we, the United States, started with when this conflict started were, number one, strengthen NATO unity. Number two, no war with Russia on Ukrainian soil. And number three, support Ukraine. And when you take a look at all of the hardware, all of the software, all of the contributions, all of the plans, all of the activities, all the by, with, and through, when you filter all those decisions through those three strategic objectives, you quickly start to understand why we have made the decisions that we've made up to this point. And you also understand that a decision in 2025 is probably going to be a little bit different than when you take a look at a decision over the same hardware and software of something that occurred in 2022. Because those three strategic objectives still exist, and how hard you have to push and how much you have to give and take with respect to what type of hardware that goes in today, given the disposition of the Ukrainian armed forces in 2023 versus 2021 versus 2022 versus 2027. All of that has to be taken into account. And it's really easy to sit here in 2023 and have foul remarks about actions that took place 12 months ago. And what we all know is the conditions on the ground and the conditions in the environment and the global conditions are different every second of the day. And for all of us, we have to be smart enough to know that when we're trying to make these decisions, you have to go back to the basic strategic objectives of the campaign, and you obviously need to take into account what is unfolding across the earth as we speak. And today, as we approach 2024, as many of us know, there are some unique tensions that exist in the Asia Pacific that might be a little bit more pronounced than they were 6 months ago. And Ronan, all of those need to be taken into account all of the time. And And what is counterproductive is looking over your shoulder and embracing discussions about why you didn't do X, Y, and Z. You should certainly draw lessons learned, but you certainly have to be prepared for the environment as it exists today and make sure that you're closely tied to the strategic objectives.
Obviously as, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, you're aware and familiar with the entirety of Ukrainians, military capabilities. But I think one thing, at least to a lot of civilians, that surprised people when the full-scale invasion happened was that within the first few days or few weeks, the Russians, planes and helicopters, attack helicopters, were only flying up to or close to a line of contact. They were no longer flying deep into Ukraine itself. Why is it, and it still puzzles people, that the Russians were not able to establish air superiority over an air force that has much older planes, probably about 1/5 or 1/4 the number of combat aircraft as the Russians? How did that happen, and where does that stand now?
Well, for all of us, we shouldn't forget achieving air superiority is incredibly difficult. And I'm a career fighter pilot. And some of the things that we've seen in previous conflicts, the ones I've been embraced in for the last 40 years, achieving that air superiority by the United States and by some of their allies in certain regions occurred fairly quick. And we might be just a little bit guilty of making it look probably easier than it actually is. So now you're in a situation to where there's an invasion in February of 22, but actually, for all of us, something happened in 2014. So as most of us could imagine, there was some pretty good training and pretty good assisting that was taking place from 2016 to 2022 with our partners, the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian armed forces. And those efforts improved the disposition of the Ukrainian armed forces for the period of time I know, and I was involved in it, from 2016 to 2022. So the Ukrainian armed forces were probably a little bit more capable than their foes probably imagined at the time of the invasion. And the other piece of this is this thing called air-land integration that Russia would have needed to exhibit in order to comfortably enter Ukraine and achieve localized air superiority is very, very difficult when you cross the sovereign border of a home nation. When you think about that, you can take a look at all the previous confrontations that have occurred over time. Is when you threaten somebody's sovereignty, what you thought that might be easy typically never is. And that was certainly the case. So I think there's a combination of a tough and committed Ukrainian armed forces and a Russian military that was challenged with respect to their own command and control and their ability to demonstrate lethality in air-land integration. And air-land integration is not easy. Many of our nations in Europe and the United States are pretty good at air-land integration. As a commander of large military forces for the majority of my Air Force career, I will tell this audience, I have never, ever, ever been satisfied with the posture or the speed of the forces that I've commanded. And I commanded some incredibly capable air-land integration forces. No matter how good we thought we were, or they thought they weren't good enough, and they had to be better tomorrow than they were yesterday. And all those ingredients put together made this nefarious attack that Russia committed in violating the borders of Ukraine very, very tough. And as most of us have seen over time, we've characterized their initial push into Ukraine as far less than satisfactory to the Russian armed forces. It's difficult. And I walk away with 2 points. Air-land integration and command and control for the Russian armed forces probably wasn't as good as they thought it was going to be once they commenced their attack. And the resolve and the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces was pretty doggone good, because that was a nation in defense of their sovereign soil.
And just kind of the flip side of that, discussing air superiority, it took some time, but Last year, the Ukrainians had some great gains in the north around Kharkiv and then later near Kherson. But now it probably a much more prolonged and difficult period for the war. The counteroffensive, perhaps the media or some people trying to make political hay, maybe expanded expectations for what could be done by the Ukrainians against an embedded, much larger defensive force across 600-700 miles. But air superiority, like you mentioned, for the United States, for your audience, World War II, that was definitive for any major offensive capabilities we took on. Obviously, for combat, you're very familiar with it as a pilot and then later in leadership. For both wars in Iraq, establishing air superiority was very necessary and done first before any large-scale ground movements could take place. Knowing that the Ukrainians are not in a position to do that yet, where do you see the counteroffensive? And we hear about F-16s, but that's further down the line. Where do you see the status of the war for the next few months?
It's going to be there later rather than sooner. All of us want this over with tomorrow. It's probably not going to be over with tomorrow. What I believe the Ukrainian armed forces have to continue to do is stick to a steady, positive military campaign momentum. And that steady, positive, successful military campaign momentum, I believe, will ultimately put them in a position to where success will be achieved. And what the definition of success is it depends. We will see. I believe that weapon systems have to abide by those three strategic objectives that I passed out. You have to support Ukraine. And for many of us, we went through discussions 8, 9, 10 months ago about why aren't we giving F-16s to the Ukrainian armed forces now? And that was 9 months ago. And again, if you go back to the strategic objective, support Ukraine. What you'll typically find is if you start passing out tricks and toys and gadgets that are not comfortable with the owning military, you'll be in a position to where aircraft and fighter aircraft are very, very complicated. You want to make sure that you have the right maintenance force. You want to make sure that you have the right sustainment force. You want to make sure that you have the right supply chain management to get all the parts in. You want to make sure that your personnel are arrayed appropriately so that between maintainers and sustainers and operators, you have the appropriate mix. And if you don't get that formula right, what you'll wind up having is a dozen or so aircraft that sit on the ramp and don't fly. And then you have a dozen or so aircraft that sit on the ramp and they become potential targets for the enemy. And you've now complicated the challenge that the Ukrainian armed forces are going through. First of all, Ukraine made the decision that we really, really do want F-16s. And of course, they wanted them a long time ago, but this is a decision that had to be made by, with, and through NATO and achieve the consensus of 30 nations for a bit and then 31 nations with the addition of Finland to the NATO alliance. So all of that becomes part of the equation. And as so many of you have heard recently about the F-16s, you shouldn't expect a silver bullet change that will occur in just a matter of weeks or months. This is a sophisticated weapon system that requires well-trained maintainers, well-trained sustainers, and very well-trained operators that not only aviate the aircraft, but also understand how to work with the soldiers on the ground so that there's effective air-land integration at the point of attack. We in the United States Air Force, and we, many nations of NATO, have been working for decades on air-land integration with a sophisticated weapon system like the F-16. And those nations will be quick to point out that it takes many, many years to be adept at employing that weapon system. And you've probably heard that from several senior U.S. leaders over the course of the last 72 hours. So we're excited over the opportunity to get the F-16 into the Ukrainian armed forces. But we in the military have to be more focused on making sure that the training is perfect, the maintenance is perfect, the integration is perfect, and then once we get that F-16 weapon system into the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces, that it will be a system that they can fly with impunity, and when they employ it, it will be an asset as opposed to a liability. And I just passed to this group, and many of you understand this better than I. That kind of stuff is not easy, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. The last thing we want to have happen is impose this F-16 weapon system on the Ukrainian armed forces and put them in a position to where they're hurrying too much, and before you know it, you've got some incidents or accidents that are occurring for the Ukrainian armed forces that cause potential loss of aircraft or loss of life. And we want to make sure we do this right. So that's kind of a big hand over a little map with respect to some of those challenges.
And to look at the next, few weeks of, the counteroffensive, especially perhaps before get into the rain and the muddy season, and then into winter when things are more complicated. Some people might have seen the reports in the headlines that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, and the person who took your position last year, General Cavoli, the current NATO Supreme Allied Commander and Commander of U.S. all U.S. forces in Europe, that they were advising their Ukrainian counterparts that you should not be spreading your forces so evenly across the entire front, and that they're potentially advising them to make one large-scale force to push through the south, maybe push through the Melitopol to get to the Sea Azov, and maybe cut off the land bridge to Crimea. What are your thoughts on that? And obviously, the flip side for the Ukrainians is if we pull too many people from another part of the front, the Russians push there. So it's very difficult, but can you talk about the strategy there?
I can. First of all, these two people that you're referring to, Roman, Mark Milley is the chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, a tremendous soldier, a tremendous patriot. Chris Cavoli is the current Supreme Allied Commander for Europe in the United States EUCOM European Commander. Those three strategic objectives, they understand better than I right now because they're in the middle of it. They are giving their best military advice to their counterparts as their counterparts execute the conflict. But they also understand, General Milley and General Cavoli, that their actions are by, with, and through the Ukrainian armed forces. They're not shy about giving their best advice. They're also not naive in thinking that every single input that they make is going to be saluted to and followed by the Ukrainian armed forces. They understand that General Zaluzny, who is the counterpart of General Milley, has a responsibility to all of his Ukrainian military, and he is ultimately going to give his best military advice to President Zelensky, and they will execute the Ukrainian armed forces' best military campaign plan to do the things that they need to do to protect their sovereign soil and ultimately put us in a position to where we can generate more peace in the region as opposed to the current conflict. I will tell you that the relationship that General Milley has with his counterpart and all of his counterparts in the Ukrainian armed forces is very, very strong, and I know that General Cavoli's relationship with all of his counterparts, many of those the same counterparts, is very, very strong. And I know that the Ukrainian Chief of Defense takes their counsel with great care, but I also know that the Ukrainian Chief of Defense, General Zaluzny, is committed to the sovereignty of his nation, and he'll be the one making decisions about what they're going to do with their armed forces. And many tidbits of information have been passed back and forth through all those leaders. And oh, by the way, there's 30 other nations of NATO that have chiefs of defense. And guess what General Zaluzny gets to listen to, who is the current Chief of Defense of Ukraine? All of those wonderful leaders. And I will tell you that he listens to General Milley. He listens to the chair of the military committee at NATO. He listens to the Chod from Poland. He listens to all those Chods. And they give him lots of really, really good advice. But at the end of the day, General Zaluzny, through the counsel of his boss, President Zelensky makes the decisions about what the Ukrainian armed forces are going to do?
You know, as kind of in history, you know, in modern history, since World War II, most wars are over the first few weeks or months, or if they get beyond a year, there's a good chance they're going to last a lot longer than that. You know, this to a degree has become a war of attrition. The Ukrainians have fought incredibly courageously, great morale, great effectiveness and inventiveness in terms of how they're fighting. But they're against a military force that has a population of 3 to 4 times the number of people to draw from, you know, despite hundreds of thousands of young Russians who protested and left the country, who may not have wanted to fight. But, you know, there's a saying that at a certain point, you can have the quality, but a certain continuous degree of quantity creates a quality of its own. How concerned are you that if we keep going like this, you know, massive artillery barrages back and forth day after day, that the rates of attrition, Putin is obviously willing to let as many of his people die as possible, but it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to keep up.
Well, there's a fair amount of terms of art that you put into that statement, and we all know that terms of art are nice, but when there's bloodshed in the battle space, it's serious time. I'll just start with the basics. This is a conflict of values, and I believe that this audience, being very, very sophisticated and having a very, very high collective IQ, this thing called values, it's big. It can't be compromised. And I think I speak for the current administrations that represent the NATO nations and certainly the United States. This conflict of values, it can't be lost. And as you've heard the NATO Secretary General say on many occasions, we'll continue to do whatever it takes. So when you get into these discussions about the so-called attrition that exists on both sides, and the sides that exist on both sides, and you take a look at all of the hardware and software that goes into Ukraine, that comes from nations around the world, and you start to do the long collective math, and you start to have statements about, well, you know, Putin's really good at doing this, he'll do it forever. Well, nothing is forever. Things change. But what shouldn't change is the fact that this is a conflict of values, and we cannot lose. So whatever it takes to support Ukraine as a U.S. and as a NATO, you've heard our national leaders and you've heard our NATO leaders continue to comfortably pass on to the civilian communities. Will continue for as long as it takes. And again, the situations will continue to change. For this thing to go more than one day was one day too long. For it to go 1 month was 1 month too long. When is it going to end? I would suspect that it's going to end later rather than sooner. And the definition of end is going to be curious. And if we wind up in some degree of settlement, I suspect when it's all said and done, the Russians aren't probably going to be as happy as they would prefer, and I suspect the Ukrainians may not be as happy as they would prefer. But this is going to support Ukraine, and the president of that nation, elected by the citizens of that nation, will have a big say in how this goes. But for right now, I believe that President Zelensky is comfortable in the fact that those prime ministers and those presidents, certainly of the 31 nations that represent NATO, continue to understand that this is a conflict of values, and they'll do whatever it takes to continue to support Ukraine. And I don't see that waning over time, based off my cross-check of the attitudes of the great patriots that walked into this chamber tonight, and certainly with the discussions that I've had with many NATO military members, citizens of Sweden recently, citizens of Finland within 24 hours. The support still exists very, very strongly from the European nations, from nations across the globe, and certainly from the nations of NATO.
as you noted, this war started, 9 years ago, 2014, but obviously since the dramatic escalation by Putin, the full-scale invasion last year, the levels of casualties are devastating. By far the largest, most deadly war in Europe since World War II. Estimates of 500,000 total casualties, injured and killed. About maybe 120,000 Russians killed, and probably about 70, maybe more, thousand Ukrainians killed, and at least 10,000 Ukrainian innocent civilians killed. Your expertise is on military strategy. But for what you know of Ukrainian leadership and obviously what you've studied of Russian leadership, a lot of people say neither Putin or Zelensky are anywhere close to being at a point where they'd make an agreement for some sort of armistice or peace deal. Neither of them feels militarily they've achieved what they want to achieve, and politically, especially probably for Putin, it could be disastrous if he led to a bad decision. Where do you see any chances of some sort of break or even pause in the fight in the next few months or next year?
Well, unfortunately, as I said already, it's going to be later rather than sooner, and I think we've all felt that way since February 22 when it started. We were kind of hoping for 7 days, then we were hoping for several months, and yes, based off many of the things you just talked about, Roman, with respect to the leaders of the nations, it certainly doesn't look like there's any resolution on the near horizon. But President Zelensky represents the citizens of Ukraine. And I had the opportunity to talk to several folks who are here right now who are Ukrainian. And when you talk about those casualties, just one human hurt is one too many, especially if it's your son or your daughter or your mom or your dad. And as you can imagine, as a military leader, I've had the luxury and the privilege to meet many of the soldiers, many of the family members that represent the fallen of those soldiers. And President Zelensky cares about each and every one of his Ukrainian citizens. And I contend that the decisions that I've seen he make over the course of the last several months, I realize that he, his Minister of Defense, his Minister of Interior, and certainly his Chief of Defense, that they are taking every single aspect of this conflict into account, every single second of the day. So, Roman, we like to characterize that we're thinking this way for the next several months, and then we're thinking this way for the next several months, and then we have a counteroffensive, and we're thinking this way in the next several months, and it looks like it's going to be a long time. None of us can ever predict what's going to happen tomorrow, but what we appreciate are when national presidents, and what I appreciate are when commanders take into account the exact disposition of the conditions in air, land, sea, space, and cyber, SOF, the information environment, and the nuclear environment, every single millisecond of the day. And military commanders get paid the luxury of leading sons and daughters into conflict to take all those variables into account. So I don't see sooner rather than later, but I sure hope like heck an armistice or a ceasefire comes sooner rather than later. It will only occur if the leaders of those nations are attuned to what is taking place. And I only have the luxury of having had the opportunity to work closely and around President Zelensky. And I can comfortably promise this group, he's dialed in to what the citizens of that nation are going through. And the loss of just one more Ukrainian is unsatisfactory in his eyes, and he's taking that into account. So we'll see. But because of the things you just talked about, and because of the fact that this is a conflict of values, it's taken a long time.
You mentioned a conflict of values, and obviously the much bigger, kind of broader, long-term concern for the U.S. You mentioned the Eastern Pacific. You think of China, you think of Taiwan. President Xi, his own claims on Taiwan, and despite 70 years of a successful, thriving democracy. Again, I know you're not a Chinese political specialist. Even the best people in U.S. intelligence don't know exactly what President Xi is thinking. But how do you think the way the war has progressed and maybe surprised the Russians may have impacted Chinese kind of thoughts with regards to Taiwan? Obviously a completely different, very, very different war if something was to happen, but do you think it's impacted the kind of strategic thinking, especially in terms of, hey, these allies are actually sticking together. If we do something here, the Japanese, the South Koreans, are they going to, and the Americans all be there again?
Yes, and very much so. I think when Putin kicked this off, he was absolutely positively convinced that he could fracture the solidarity of the NATO nations. And he didn't. And I think he was absolutely positively convinced that his command and control was better than the enemy's command and control. I think he was absolutely positively convinced, he being Putin, that the military buildup along Eastern Europe wouldn't materialize. Everything that Putin didn't want to have happen, happened. 2 additional nations have accessed to NATO. In the blink of an eye, 140,000 soldiers along Eastern Europe were under the operational control of the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. None of those were good activities for Putin. Neither one of those did he anticipate. I suspect that in his conversations, if Putin did have conversations with President Xi before this started, I doubt that he did, I'll bet you that President Xi was shocked to see how quickly NATO was able to transfer its forces under a military commander. And I think President Xi was probably shocked to see the accession of Finland and soon to be Sweden once we cross the T's and dot the I's. Those are Herculean shifts in the posture of Europe's military. Those are Herculean shifts in support of NATO, which I believe in the history of humanity has been characterized by many authors and many experts as the strongest alliance in the history of humanity. I think that's a fair call. NATO is only stronger than it was a year ago, and the military forces are more capable than they were a year ago, and certainly the size of NATO is getting bigger. And that is an indication that those sophisticated nations of Europe that represent NATO understand that this is a conflict of values. We can't lose. And that's something that we know China has observed, and it's something if we don't carry through with, we're pretty certain that China will take note of. So all of that comes into play. The pressure that is on NATO has always been very, very high. It will continue to be high. We anticipate that this should be the case. And when you start to have bad activity occurring in different parts of the globe outside of the European continent, you understand that NATO, being the most advanced and sophisticated alliance in the history of humanity, bears the responsibility to strive to achieve perfection. Even more so when you have the activities that we see in China with respect to Taiwan. So the pressure is there. That's okay. NATO wants to be better tomorrow than it is today in all areas. And with that attitude and understanding what's at stake from a global security perspective, NATO's going to keep pressing in the direction that they are.
And lastly, and then I want to jump into the audience questions. Obviously, it's a topic that could be a full hour or two by itself. But we've had the privilege of hosting a lot of your counterparts, American generals and admirals, and all different levels from all the services. They all might say it reluctantly, but most of them will say, in reality, the Air Force, your 4 decades in the Air Force, is often the key of modern advanced warfare. The best research and development, the cutting edge, whatever weaponry is on the books, or people don't even realize is on the books. Can you tell us a little bit about how this war maybe is impacting kind of the projections for, God forbid something happened in Taiwan, but where modern warfare is going? The idea of, say, AI, autonomous, free-flying drones, the use of lasers, all that sort of, how is this war shaping kind of modern warfare?
I could talk for about a decade on this, and obviously I'm a little bit biased towards the Air Force, but what this conflict reveals to us is that what you do in air, land, sea, space, cyber, the information environment, the special forces environment, to include the nuclear environment, he or she, as the ultimate leader of a nation, that can take all of those domains and interoperate all those domains at the highest degree of command and control, with unmatched speed, with perfect posture, is probably going to achieve victory. And we are seeing that throughout the course of this campaign. We are seeing what combined arms, certainly in air, land, and sea, can do against a foe who is challenged in that area. So to sit here and say that it's got to be those beautiful 5th generation fighter aircraft, or it's got to be a destroyer, or it's got to be a sub, or it's got to be the world's quickest shoot, move, and communicate infantry company, or it has to be the world's greatest brown water Marines. It has to be the world's best SOF operators. It's not just one service. It's air, land, sea, space, cyber, SOF, info, and what we do in the nuclear environment and space environment to make sure that the integration of all those domains at the point of attack is perfect. It'll never be perfect, but as we execute and as we watch the Ukrainian armed forces execute, and as we've seen the Ukrainian armed forces get better from when we started heavy advising and assisting in 2016, they're a sophisticated military today, and they're shooting for that perfection. And they know coming short in any shape, form, or fashion is not a great place to be chasing. I say all that because so many of you are very, very familiar with the fact that when this conflict kicked off in February of 22, what was taking place in cyber and what was taking place in the information environment is going to be written about in books in about 20 or 30 years when the security classification comes off what unfolded. But we should be smart enough to know that some of the successes and some of the failures that were achieved in the initial stages of this conflict probably had a little bit to do about what was taking place in the information in the cyber environment. And I say that because it reveals to us all those domains need to be brought into account at the point of attack when you're in a confrontation. And sophisticated 21st century and 22nd century militaries need to be focused on the integration of those unique campaigns to make sure that they can achieve the combined effect that they want to achieve at the point of attack. And they better do it fast, and they better do it with perfectly postured forces. And as long as we have humans that are in charge of these campaigns, you'll never find a good commander, he or she, that's satisfied with speed or posture. They're always nugging and tugging and pushing and shoving to find ways to get the wonderful people that they have the opportunity to command to achieve perfection with speed and posture. And they're striving to get there. So that's where I think we're headed, and I know that's certainly where General Zaluzny is headed with his Ukrainian armed forces.
I love all the questions, but in particular, I always love having great questions from the great students who are here tonight, high school and college students. It's the start of the semester, so even more impressed that you guys got here now, so thank you. Great question from Erica from the Audi School. Erica asks, in relation to the protesters outside, which some of you may have noticed, Why do you think citizens would oppose NATO and then point to the BRICS as a preferable group despite the member nations' history of human rights abuses?
Well, and so many of you heard this, and it's not meant to sound corny, but and I suspect that so many of you, because I had the opportunity to shake some of your hands when you came in, I adore the fact that those protesters are sitting out there. I adore the fact that we have conditions on the ground that allow for that expression, number one. And that goes back to values. I adore our democratic values. This thing called free speech is a big deal. It produces Pulitzer Prize winners. It's our foundation. And somebody, a human being on planet Earth, having the right to express his or her opinion is just fine by me. That's usually a sign of health. So we should continue to promote that, and some of those protesters that are protesting against NATO in sustaining their solidarity are probably, unbeknownst to them, protesting against the very freedom that they have to express their opinion. And we've all kind of been down this logic path, but at the end of the day, that's a great question. And I would answer it with the way that I've answered it. This thing called values that allows us the opportunity to have free speech and express our opinions, that's a really good thing.
How you kind of walk that tightrope, and absolutely no one wants to see a nuclear war, but the opposite side of that is nuclear blackmail. That if we give in to Putin now, maybe he next invades some other neighbor to Russia. Or President Xi in China says, if you don't let me reclaim Taiwan, I'm willing to use nuclear weapons. Can you discuss that very difficult balance that you and that kind of leadership has to take on?
Number one, you need to plan and prepare for thousands and thousands of courses of actions. And as we say in military circles, our planners, they never sleep. And we literally have the best planners on planet Earth because they represent our value system. And if you're not prepared to react to all different levels of conflict, your ability to deter is less effective. And if you're not part of a military that is willing to think out of the box about all the potential courses of actions that a potential foe can take against you, and have a well-oiled, fine-tuned response to that action, you're probably not in a good military. And needless to say, the NATO nations and the United States represent some pretty sophisticated militaries. So whatever it is, a foe of ours, and in this particular case, what you're referencing is the potential for Putin to execute some kind of drastic measure that could be nuclear. You shouldn't be surprised that hasn't been thought about with respect to a NATO response or a United States response. And we all understand proportionality, we all understand lethality, we all understand impactfulness, and you as a nation and we as NATO should be prepared at many different levels to have an appropriate response. And without getting into classified preparation or planning, rest assured that there's a degree of responses that the United States and the NATO nations are prepared to go to in the event that something that you referred to happens to unfortunately take place. That's extreme, and we should be prepared for extreme, and we are.
Situations. What would you like to leave the United States in terms of where we are with this war? Obviously, we don't want it to escalate, but we obviously don't want to turn our backs politically or militarily or economically on a country that's basically been attacked by a rogue state. What would you like the audience to leave tonight with?
We want this conflict to end. We want to respect the sovereignty of nations. That is certainly their right to protect their sovereignty. What I think is very precious in this entire process, and I touched on it several times, is this thing called values. And if I could just neck down to the United States, the civil-military relationship that exists within a nation that has a sophisticated military is the most precious relation to that nation, demonstrating the ability to protect their sovereign soil. And this civil-military relationship is incredibly important. And it's something that always needs to be nurtured, and it always needs to be examined. You need to look at ways to make it better in the future, but a civilian-led military has proved to be very, very beneficial for the United States for many, many years, and it's proven to be very, very beneficial for the European nations. It's precious. And this process that we have, that we abide to the Constitution and we allow folks to express their opinion, it's important. And the fact that military leaders understand that they have a civilian boss is very, very important. And the fact that the relationship is precious is very, very important. And I hope that what we have in 2023 is stronger and better in 2024. And to this group, I would commit to you that we're committed to advancing that cause. And that makes this thing called global security attainable, and we're going to work very, very hard to get there.
Will you all join me in not just thanking you for this evening, but obviously join me all in thanking General Tod Wolters for dedicating basically your entire adult life to serving our nation. Thank you very much.